Hello everyone, my name is Lowko and welcome to some more StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void. Now, as you may be aware, the very first season of 2016 has finally begun. The last season of 2015 has ended just a couple of days ago, and obviously when it actually did end, I was over in the United States, so I couldn't actually start playing immediately. So I played this game that we're watching here today last night on the live stream over at twitch.tv. And I actually did this one as the very first game. So this is the placement match that I ended up playing, and honestly, it's one of the only good macro games that I played yesterday. In most of the games, honestly, I've seen just really a lot of cheese. I don't know if that's just my experience, but practically all of the games that I played yesterday, and also actually some the day before on a random account, were just exclusively cheese. I think currently, usually it's about the first 2 weeks or so of the season where this is this much cheese, but I think currently there's probably about 80% of the games that are just, you know, 13-12 in Zerg vs Zerg, and like proxy Reapers in Zerg vs Terran, and like proxy Gateways in Zerg vs Protoss, and it's all people, like at least at my level of play, that are desperately trying to get a spot in Grandmaster League. So they're trying to grind out as many games as possible, try and get as many cheap wins as possible before they start playing macro games, because they didn't get chosen to get the Grandmaster. But anyway, I don't really have any particular goals for this one, but in this particular game though, that we are watching here, I felt like I played quite alright. Now you gotta keep in mind that obviously I was a little bit rusty. It goes rather quickly, I've noticed with StarCraft 2, that if you don't play for a couple days even, you get rather rusty, and I can't really perform nearly as well as I usually do. But in this particular game, I felt very focused. I was looking forward to the stream all day long, so I was really excited to finally start playing StarCraft again, and yeah, we ended up playing a rather good game. So, as far as my current Zerg vs Zerg build order goes, like I mentioned, a lot of cheese. I expected a lot of cheese as well, and in general, ZVZ is very cheesy. So I went for a 14-14, gonna go for Zergling speed, gonna go for the Baling Nest, a Queen, and then eventually get the expansion up as well. So, relatively, you know, safe macro focus, but I'm not by any means of the, or like by any stretch of the imagination going all in with this. I mean, I have the option to. I could go for a lot of Lings and a lot of Banes, and I could try and, you know, basically get a lot of like cheap advantages that way. But you can see, even though I went for the safest builds, I'm already 4 supply behind it. That's not really something I can really stop from happening. If you go hatchery first, like my opponent does in this particular game, you know, you just end up losing a whole bunch of matches to people that play 13-12. Now, he did mention that he's learned his very first build from me, so I assume here at the very least he has a decent understanding of the fact that I barely ever cheese, especially in ZVZ, because I really dislike the matchup when it comes to the cheesy state. And I guess he just sort of took the risk and went with it. Now, we are going to play a relatively laid-back game, and the one thing in particular that I want to be talking about is using the alt hotkeys for 2 reasons. So first off, to make the defending of the third base a little bit easier, and then secondly, also to be able to do run-bys with roaches. So in this particular game, we're going to be having some Roach Ravager play, and obviously my opponent is also going to go for Roach Ravager, and there's not going to be any kind of Mutalisks play, even though that's a little more common, it seems like, especially as of the latest patch. But in general, it's just going to be a very basic Roach Ravager versus Roach Ravager fights, where I want to be discussing the run-by aspect, the defending aspect of the third base in particular, and then also just fighting in general when you play Roach Ravager. So there's a couple things we can be touching upon. Early part of the game though, it's gonna be relatively safe. I'm just constantly checking, he's constantly checking. We're trying to test the waters. I am adding on a Spine Crawler right now, just to make sure that, you know, at the very least I have a decent understanding of what's happening, and I spot a ton of Zerglings from my opponent. So at this point I'm checking, okay, not gonna see an Evo Chamber right now, so I know at the very least there's not gonna be like a ton of aggression coming my way, but I will need to defend whatever aggression he's gonna throw at me. So at this point it's gonna be 31 Harfests for the 31. I am adding on a Roach Warren as well as an Evolution Chamber right now, just to make sure that I can go for some Roach play. For a timing for that, if you're wondering, usually if you have a decent saturation like I do right now, I have, you know, 31 Harfests at this point. I just tend to get the Roach Warren and the Evo Chamber roughly 4 minutes into it, then drone up heavily and get some extra gases going. So I'm making a ton of extra drones here, just trying to make sure that I secure that economic lead. Now, speaking of the economic lead in this particular game, you can see, like, this is the micro I'm talking about. This is the rustiness that I'm talking about, right? Like, that should never have happened. I tried boxing my units away there, but it didn't happen, right? Like, it's just poor micro, poor control. But anyways, as far as the economic advantage goes, I actually felt like I was drawing up rather okay while playing the game. But looking back at the replay, and I just obviously had a quick look at the replay as well, just to sort of freshen up my memory, I noticed that I actually didn't draw nearly as aggressively as I should. I also actually didn't spot that I killed this very first worker when I was actually in the game, but I was just keeping tabs on my opponent's third base, trying to figure out whether or not he was going for it. Now in these spawn locations on Central Protocol, you can usually go ahead and take the gold base as well, especially in ZVZ. And once again, a little micro mistake right there that's gonna cost me a whole bunch of Zerglings, and all these little, like, itty-bitty mistakes. You can see the supply counts, well actually just a second ago at the very least, were incredibly in favor of my opponent. Now you gotta keep in mind I just pumped out a whole bunch of roaches. Those are immediately gonna, you know, skyrocket my supply, but everything together, it adds up quite a bunch. He's definitely slightly ahead at this moment. He's already got the lair about halfway done. I haven't even started mine yet, and in all, it's just not looking that amazing. Now, here's the problem, right? Here's the problem, not just on Central Protocol, but also on all other maps. If I send all of these roaches towards the third base, I will likely be able to defend it. However, if I send all of my roaches over there, he can just simply run by into my main base, since the Spinecrawler is only covering the natural, right? So, I most of the time end up losing the third base at least one time. Now what I should be doing immediately is send over all of these roaches to the third base and use these 7 reinforcing roaches that I got to defend. Now, as you can see, I am moving out across the map. This is a pretty big misplay, because he immediately spots this with the overlord that is over there, and I end up losing that third. That's a big loss right there. That's a big loss, and something that shouldn't be happening. So something to learn right off the get-go here. Split up the roaches, at least have like 4 or so roaches ready to sit at the third base to snipe away those Zerglings that are being annoying, because I knew they were out on the map somewhere. And make sure that you don't get caught off guard like that. Even if your opponent doesn't end up running by, it is still worth doing it. Now here's where I use the Alt hotkey, okay? So the Alt hotkey is basically a thing that you can use in Legacy of the Void. You select a bunch of your current roaches, hit Alt plus whatever hotkey you want to add them to, and what happens is that you basically split off a bunch of the units and add them to that new control hotkey. And I keep using that right now, at least I tried using that a lot over the last couple of weeks, to split off units into smaller little groups. So the units right now that are at my third base are bound to a separate hotkey. They're not going to be part of the main fight, but at the very least I will like ensure myself to not lose that base once again. Now we're sort of just testing the waters a little bit. If you have to take a look at income though, I am pretty far behind. So in these screens, I'm gonna be the blue player right now. It is 38 Harvesters versus 50. And you can see just all the little advantages that he had early on start counting up, right? Him going hatchery first, me losing a bunch of Zerglings here, me losing a bunch of Zerglings there, me losing the third base one time, me not having vision of the third, of his third rather. It just all adds up very quickly, and you can see my opponent start skyrocketing in supply. Now there's one thing in Zerg vs Zerg that is currently very popular, and that is, like I mentioned, the Roach versus Ravager fights. Like Roach Ravager versus Roach Ravager. And the thing about Legacy of the Void is that it's not as clean cut anymore as in Heart of the Swarm, right? In Heart of the Swarm, oftentimes you had to look at the amount of supply, the amount of drones that your opponent had, the amount of roaches that he would likely be having at that point, and then upgrades. And at that point, it's basically just 2 big lines of roaches fighting against, you know, another big line of roaches, right? That's basically what Heart of the Swarm, Zerg vs Zerg was all about. Now in Legacy of the Void, the Ravager sort of mixes that up a lot. The Ravager ensures that you can at the very least have a reasonable, you know, a reasonable engagement, even if your army is a little bit smaller. And that's exactly what we're going to be seeing in this game as well. So even at that point, even though I got a gold base going, so I will get slightly more income out of it, you can see my opponent having significantly more Harvesters and being at a very solid lead. Now the one thing that does get me back into this game are the roach run-bys. So I am aware at this point that I am more than likely behind. You can actually see a bunch of banelings headed to my third base as well. And I end up losing a bunch more workers there. But I am aware that I am more than likely behind at this point in the game, just because of all the small little leads that my opponent managed to go for. And I am a little bit worried here. I'm trying to think, like, what could I do? I could try and tech up to lurkers. Very risky, though. If I go up to lurkers, there's a small chance that we'll actually get to that point in the game, and I'll likely just get overrun with, like, a +2/+1 timing attack from my opponent. Going up to, you know, any other units, like Mutalisk or whatever, is also a massive risk, because he likely won't allow me to get a whole bunch of them up. So this is one of the things I've been trying to practice with. You obviously have there's not going to be that big of an engagement right away. Like, it's going to be a little bit of a skirmish here, but we're just testing the waters for the most part. you can go for the Tunneling Claws upgrade and obviously the Burrow upgrade as well. And while that's still an investment, don't get me wrong, that's 350 minerals, no, 250 minerals and 250 gas. It is still quite a big commitment, but you can actually use it quite efficiently to harass on big maps like this. So at this point, I'm already starting to split up units once again using the Alt hotkey for that. And in a little bit, I will be able to do the same with the run-bys with the Tunneling Claws as well as the Burrow upgrade. So at this point, I will be able to pick off quite a significant amount of workers from him. And even though, you know, the roaches are obviously mostly just being a nuisance, he is forced to try and deal with that, right? He's forced to try and deal with that. And it's one of the things that I personally kept losing to. And if you actually practice it a whole bunch, which I did pretty much every single ZVZ that I got the chance to yesterday, it actually gets rather easy. I mean, you simply just select a small group of the units that you have in your main control group, hit Alt +2 or Alt +3, which removes them off of hotkey number 1 and adds them to control group 2 or 3, and then you can just use the Burrow upgrade to constantly micro about here. So even at this point, it's 4 roaches that I'm forcing off of the line myself. He is also forced to use a bunch of those roaches himself, right? Like, he has his own roaches sitting right there trying to be annoying, and at the same time, I'm also shoving with the main army, and all of a sudden, I managed to get significantly ahead while fighting. Now, the second thing I wanted to discuss as well is shooting the corrosive biles. My opponent actually does it really, like, relatively well in this particular game, where he actually uses the corrosive bile as like a spread out. What I see a lot of people do when I coach them is sort of like focus all of the corrosive bile on one spot and cross their fingers and hope the Zerg player is not gonna notice, or Terran player, or Zerg, or Protoss player, right? Basically what you want to do is just spam them everywhere, spam them where the armies could be coming. Force the Zerg player in this particular case to split up his forces or to make the decision to move forward. But force them to move. If you send everything in one massive engagement or in one like massive funnel, you're in trouble, right? Like that right there, let me back up for just a second. That right there, what my opponent did was definitely not the most efficient way of doing it. So you can see over here, he starts spamming it all over the place, right? You have a little bit of a hard time spotting it, but it's like little glowy circles on the ground right now, and I'm forced to move forward. Now, he does something else right here. Right here is good if I would be a bad player, right? And while I do definitely make mistakes, this only works if your opponent is bad, right? If I just move forward and I allow him to lure me back in there, he's gonna take out a clump like that in amount of roaches that I got right now, which is a risk reward sort of situation. Instead, what's likely better is just simply to spam like in a line and force me to not manage to get on this fight at all. Right now, I can just simply box a bunch of these armies or a bunch of these units, send them to the right side of the map and the other half to the left, and all of a sudden, I'm gonna set up a very, very big concave in this area, right? So if he instead would have like spammed it pretty much everywhere, I'm forced to either back up and regroup, at which point he can set up his own concave, or obviously, I would just be able to just shove forward and try and just mitigate the damage and end the game right here. Now, since I'm not completely sure how far I'm ahead at this point, I am feeling a little bit hesitant to do something like that. So it's always like a decision type thing that you have to do, and in order to practice this, it's just a matter of being in this situation 100 times. Sometimes judging the scenario is very difficult, and you just need to practice it and just say GG and jump into the next one. But general rule of thumb when trying to use corrosive bile is spam it all over the place, force them to split. This works for Terran, works for Protoss as well. Just spam it everywhere you can, make sure they cannot really get into one big position. So in this particular case, I spot the corrosive bile, split up my units, and just simply push onwards. And once again, I see it once again, and he's splitting it. He's splitting it relatively okay there, but at that point, my concave is much too big, and I decide to start shoving forward, just reinforcing with more and more units, still using little groups of run-bys just to force his units off of the line as well. And since my reinforcements are coming in across the map, I'm also gonna start pushing up to the natural. So morphing in the lurker then at this point too, as you can see, picking off whatever reinforcements are added to his army. If I can pick off the roach warren here, that would be great. Once again, trying to set up a concave to make sure that I will be able to get the superior engagement almost no matter what. And if I'm fighting against Hydras, it's gonna be relatively easy. As far as reinforcing Zerg versus Zerg in general goes, I would barely ever like reinforce with Hydralisk unless you're ensuring yourself that you're ahead. Generally speaking, you should probably go ahead and reinforce with roaches. In this particular case, obviously sniped the roach warren here at the top of the ramp, so you could only reinforce with Hydralisk. But that's the basic idea right here. So I hope at least this cleared up a couple of thoughts or a couple of questions that you may have had in the Zerg vs Zerg matchup. Main thing, use the alt control group to both defend the third base and do run bys. Consider using the burrow upgrade as well as the tunneling claws to try and get an advantage if you know that you're more than likely behind. And force your opponent to, either split his units or just back off using the corrosive bile. Those are the main three things. And also, I guess, 14-14, pretty solid build if you want to play safe in Zerg for the Zerg. And other than that, I want to thank y'all for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile, and I'll see you in the next one.